Hey guys, George at SoundTraxx here. This week we're going to continue on our series. We just did last week a little bit of an introduction to SoundTraxx where you can find some of the information that you may be looking for. But one of the things that we found out over the years is that there's a lot of terminology in the DCC world that potentially can be a little bit confusing. So we're going to touch on a couple of those today. So let's get started. So when it comes to the world of DCC, there's a lot of terminology that can be thrown around. And what happens is if you don't fully understand the terms that you're using, a lot of times they can become conflated because they're very similar, even though they're spelled and pronounced differently. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about what those terms are, some of those main things that you may hear when you're reading through the user's guide or looking at the author manual that comes with your model, so that way you have a better idea of exactly what's happening. So the first one is a very common one. This is one that we get a lot of times where we'll get calls from people saying, hey, I'm running my locomotive on my programming track and I need to know how to do XYZ. Well, there's a lot of problems with that because first off, the programming track is a DCC protocol, not necessarily the physical track. So what's happening is they're conflating the term their programming track because that's where they do most of their programming. They're conflating that with their test track, which is where they test all of the locomotive settings and so forth. And it's similar to what I have here, just a small little section of track that's connected to a DCC system that I can go in and do all my programming with. Now, the programming track is actually a specific protocol of the DCC system. And what it does is it turns off the mainline track power in the case of the power cab here, and then will actually implement a programming track protocol, in which case the locomotive doesn't make any noise. And the reason for that is because you're not actually able to test your settings on the actual programming track protocol. Because this has a unique communication back and forth between the DCC system and your locomotive, so that way, if, for example, you lost your address, you can still talk to the decoder and recover it from a mistyped address from what you thought you typed in, meaning you did something else. But a lot of people will have a separate DCC system that they have a section of track that they actually run on and test their settings. Now, in this case, if I was to go ahead and do programming commands with the locomotive active and on, it's actually on even though it's quiet because the prime mover's off and I'm in Blue Nami mode, but I'll get to that in a moment. But a lot of times they'll have their test track and they'll do all their settings and adjustments using CVs. But in that case, they're using mainline programming methods from your DCC system because they're on this small section of track that they can then instantly hear the changes, watch the changes, things like light selections, things of that nature. And so therefore they can actually see and make sure the locomotive runs the way they want it to before they pick it up and put it on their main line or their main layout where they have all their other locomotives, so that way they don't have to do any more programming or adjustments to it once it's on the main layout. But that's where a lot of people will conflate those terms, programming track and test track. So you do want to separate those because the programming track is a dedicated small section of track from your command station that allows you that unique one-on-one, basically a controlled environment that allows me to talk to this decoder only. And so that's usually what you're going to look at when it comes to the programming track. And then your test track can be a longer section like this where you can actually run your locomotive and test your settings. So for more information on this, be sure to check out some of our webinar series. Webinar 4, for example, dives deeper into what is DCC. And then webinar 6 will actually talk about programming decoders. It dives deeper into the differences between the programming track and your main line, or in this case, the test track. So be sure to check those out. Now, the next term we hear a lot of times conflated is function, or F28 or F2 or F5 or whatever it is, with the lighting output, which is FX number whatever, 1 through 8. So first off, let's differentiate between these terms. Now, when you're talking about the functions, you're talking about the functions that you're going to enable on your DCC system. So for example, these keys down here on this NCE, when I push the 1, that's sending an F1 command. When I push the 3, it's sending an F3 command, either on or off, depending on its existing state, and so forth. So when you're using the NCE, for example, if you want to access higher functions 13, 14, 15, and so on, you're pressing different buttons. So you're actually going to push and hold the shift key and the 0, and the first time you do that, that accesses functions 10 through 19. And then the 0 key becomes 10, the 1 is 11, 2 is 12, 3 is so forth, 13, and so on. If I press and hold the shift and the 0 a second time, then I get F20 through 28, in which case now the 0 key is 20, the 1 key is 21, the 2 key is 22, and so on up to 28. So when you're looking at your DCC system, that's going to vary based on which system you have. So a DigiTraxx or an MRC is going to work a little bit differently than, say, the NCE Power Cab or the Pro Cab. So you want to check out our webinar number 9 for specific instructions on how to use your command station. But that's when we're talking about the functions. Now, when we're talking about it on the Blue NAMI app, for example, here on the screen, you can see I pull out my side menu, and this is actually where everything is labeled. I'm still sending a function 1, a function 2, function 3 command, but on the screen here, you can see that it's actually labeled so that way it's easier for you to remember. With a DCC system, you have to remember function 1 is the bell, function 3 is the short horn, function 8 is mute, function 12 is the brake select, and so on. Then you have to remember how to access it using your DCC system. Or with the Blue NAMI app, as shown on the screen, it's all labeled right there. And the first 14 functions are labeled. Then we go over, then we have the second 14 functions up to 28. Now the term FX is actually our lighting output numbering system. And what that's telling you is FX1 and FX2 are basically your headlight and backup light. Now these can be repurposed to whatever you want. So if you have a locomotive that doesn't have a backup light, for example, you can repurpose that to become a firebox flicker or a cab light, or you can make it become the Mars light or whatever you want it to be. But the FX1 and 2 are your headlight backup light, then the FX3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 are the other lights that you can be reassigned in your model. So for example, you can have Mars lights, number boards, class lights, headlight, all these different lights, truck lights, whatever you want, they can all be repurposed from those other lighting outputs. So basically FX1 and FX2, as I said, are your headlight and backup light. FX3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 can be used for any other purpose. Now, the biggest thing to remember is that your FX lighting outputs are assigned to a function button to turn them on and off by default. So FX3, for example, turns on and off with the button 24 or function 24 on your throttle, which, as I mentioned, to access would be shift 0, shift 04, so that way I send the 24 command. And again, your DCC system will vary, so check the system requirements on how to access those higher functions. But F24 is not by any marriage the FX3 lighting output, because I can move the FX3 lighting output to be controlled by any button on my throttle or anything on my Blue NAMI app as I see fit. I can move it to function 5, for example, as our folks at Athearn have done. They've removed a lot of the lights from functions 24, 25, 26 down to 5 and 6, so that way they're quick, easy access on most DCC systems without having to do the special fancy throttle control therefore. So you can move these around. So FX3 is not always married to function 24. That's just how it comes default. You can set that up for yourself. Now, one of the added benefits of the Blue NAMI app, as you can see here on the screen, is that your FX3 and FX4 are labeled as Mars light and number boards. And so I can rename them using the app versus having to remember FX3 is turned on by button 24, and then how to access function 24 on this. And what was FX3? Oh, FX3 was the Mars light, for example. Or in this case, you can see on the Blue NAMI screen, FX3 is actually the number boards. So when I turn those on, you can see the number boards illuminate here on my model in front of me. So these are some of the terms that are easily conflated. So once you understand the difference between the two, now things when we write up documents or talk about them here in this particular videos, they'll make a little bit more sense. Now the last one I want to cover is CV, or the term configuration variable. And this is one that is talked about a lot because it's what allows you to make all of your adjustments and changes to the performance of your locomotive. Now, one of the misnomers that we internally at SoundTraxx don't like is the term programming, because our software engineers do the programming. You're just making adjustments to the decoder's performance or behavior based on the programming, the software programming that our engineers have designed and drawn out for you. So when you change, for example, a configuration variable for the momentum, you're just saying how long it's going to take the locomotive to accelerate to the now commanded speed step. So if I send a speed step 10 command, you're going to determine with momentum how long it takes to accelerate and decelerate from that speed step 10. And those are configuration variables. Now, to kind of explain it a little bit better, a configuration variable allows you to vary or change the configuration or the setup or the performance of the locomotive using these CVs. Now, there are a lot of different CVs throughout the decoder for all kinds of various aspects, including things like address. Yes, that's using a CV. Things like momentum, as we talked about, lighting effects, all of those things are done by changing CVs or configuration variables. Now, each configuration variable is set up with 8 bits, and now we're starting to get into some of the computer structure that we feel is a little bit shouldn't be as visible to the end user, but this is the structure that we were blessed with years ago when the DCC group got together and all the engineers came out with it. So that's why we have to do CVs. But one of the most favorite things, I talk to customers all over the country, is they really don't like changing CVs because they're afraid they're going to break it. Now, the good news is, the first thing I want to say is that you cannot break our decoders by changing CVs. If you could, we didn't do our job very well. And so there are some decoders out there where, say for example, let's talk about the air horn. Well, on our decoders, there's 44 air horns. So with some of the other brands out there, and I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus, but if I was to accidentally choose whistle number 46, the decoder says there's no data here. And so it can't proceed until it gets the information or the data. What's the air horn I'm supposed to play? But the decoder can't progress until it gets the data, but there's no data, so it turns it into a brick. So when you're programming some of the other brands out there, you do have to be careful to make sure you're setting the value the way you're supposed to. But with SoundTraxx decoders, if you accidentally type in 46 and hit enter, our decoders are smart enough to go, that's outside the range, and then kicks you back to a value of 0, so that way you can not brick your decoder or turn it into a paperweight or have to send it back for us to do some magical voodoo and unlock the decoder. So you can make these adjustments to your CVs all you like with confidence, knowing that you're going to be able to salvage that decoder. Because if all else fails, you can always reset your decoder, CV8 to a value of 8, and cycle the power. And when you do that, you'll actually reset the decoder back to the way it was when it left our factory. So that way it's just like opening a brand new decoder out of the package, putting it in, and you start from scratch. So therefore, if you got some strange behavior or unexpected results, you can always reset the decoder. And there are also partial resets that you can do. Now, there's a lot more information about CVs and all the intricacies of that, so I encourage you again to watch webinar 6, where we talk very in depth when it comes to CV programming, adjusting, and how all the CVs are structured. So I'd encourage you to check that video out as well. Now, as we've talked about programming CVs, you can use your DCC system, but one of the advantages is that when you use your Blue NAMI, you can actually do all of the settings and adjustments without having to worry about doing CV math. So when you look at our screen here, we can go ahead and see that gear down in the bottom. We're going to hit our gear, and this is where we can make all of our adjustments. So let's go back to selecting an air horn. So if we go to sound settings, we're going to go to main sounds. Now you can see here I have a Leslie A200 air horn. So when I press this, I can sample the air horn. But with the app, I can actually scroll through and see all the different air horns that are listed. So that way I can program and set up my decoder's performance confidently, knowing that the app is going to limit where my functions go or where my CV settings are, so that way you can just relax and enjoy and set up your decoder the way you want it to based on the settings through the app. So this is just another way of programming and adjusting CVs, but with the free intuitive app that you can get with your Blue Nami decoder. So we've gone a little long on this one, so my apologies on that. But one of the other last things I wanted to talk about is if you go to our website, SoundTraxx.com, and under support, where you can go to documentation and reference documents, you'll see a DCC glossary there where it'll explain a lot of these confusing terms like we've talked about today, and maybe some of the other things out there, because when you want to have a good knowledge base of when you're programming and setting up your decoders, because if you don't understand how all of this stuff works together, it's easy to get confused and it's easy to get nervous, and then you end up sacrificing your enjoyment because I'm afraid of making this particular change, so I'm just going to live with it the way it is. Even though that change you want to do may be the best thing that's ever happened. For example, dynamic digital exhaust. But if you're afraid of doing it because you don't have that knowledge, it's easy to limit your enjoyment. And that's what we want to do, is we want to make sure that you're fully knowledgeable on how all this stuff works together, so that way you can be confident knowing that with SoundTraxx products, you're not going to run into those issues. So if you have any questions about this particular video or any of the videos that we've done in the past, be sure to email us and we'll be happy to help answer any questions we can. Also, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. It helps us in the long term. It helps us know what content you're watching and what is exciting and interesting to you. And also it helps us grow our channel, because the more people that we can get this information out, the more fellow modelers out there that can enjoy running their trains. So that's it for this time, guys. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.